November 24th, 1971, 8 p.m. A Boeing 727 climbs back into the night sky over Seattle. On board, a skeleton crew, and a man with a parachute, and $200,000. Flight 305 had been on the ground for nearly 2 hours. The passengers had been released in Seattle. The ransom had been delivered. Now, Cooper had given his final instructions to the crew. Fly south toward Mexico City. Stay below 10,000 feet. Keep the speed at 170 knots. Lower the landing gear. Leave the flaps at 15 degrees. And most importantly, don't come into the cabin. Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radachek, and Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson were locked in the cockpit. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow had stayed with Cooper as long as she could, but he'd ordered her forward. She was the last person to see him alive. The rear air stair door, a unique feature of the 727, was designed as an emergency exit. It could be opened in flight, though it was never meant to be used this way. The stairway would drop down, creating a ramp into the open sky. Cooper had studied this aircraft. He knew its capabilities. He knew its weaknesses. He'd asked specific questions during the hijacking. Questions that suggested he understood aviation. Questions that made investigators wonder, who was this man? At 10,000 feet, flying at 170 knots through a storm, Dan Cooper made his way to the back of the plane. He was alone now. Completely alone. He tied the money bag to his waist. He secured the parachute harness. He approached the aft stairwell. Outside, the night was pitch black. Rain lashed against the fuselage. Wind buffeted the aircraft. The temperature had dropped to 7 degrees below zero. What happened in the next few minutes has puzzled investigators for over 50 years. Tonight, we reconstruct the jump. We analyze the physics. We speak with experts who've studied every detail of this impossible leap. We'll examine the flight conditions, the parachute equipment, the terrain below. We'll explore what the human body endures in a high-altitude jump. And we'll ask the question that's haunted investigators for decades. Could anyone have survived what D.B. Cooper attempted that night? This is Episode 2, The Jump. To understand what Cooper faced, we need to understand the Boeing 727. This aircraft was introduced in 1964 and became one of the most successful commercial jets ever built. It was designed for shorter runways and smaller airports. It was versatile, reliable, and fast. But it had one feature that made it unique: the aft air stair. Built into the rear belly of the fuselage, this stairway could be deployed on the ground to allow passengers to board without a jetway. It was a built-in staircase that folded down from the tail section. In 1971, there was no mechanical lock preventing it from being opened in flight. There was a warning light in the cockpit, but nothing physically stopped someone from operating the door at altitude. Cooper knew this. How he knew this is one of the great mysteries of the case. Boeing engineer John Detlor later explained, "The aft air stair was never designed to be opened at altitude. The aerodynamic forces, the pressure differential, the wind speed, all of it made it extremely dangerous." When Cooper approached that door, he would have encountered a lever mechanism. Pulling it would release the hydraulic locks. The stairs would drop, creating an opening approximately 6 feet wide and 9 feet tall. The moment that door opened, everything would change. At 10,000 feet, the outside air pressure is significantly lower than inside the pressurized cabin. Opening the door would create an explosive decompression event. Not catastrophic, but violent enough to knock someone off balance. The temperature differential would cause instant condensation. A cloud of fog would fill the cabin. Loose objects would be sucked toward the opening. And the noise. Former pilots who've studied the scenario describe it as deafening. The roar of the engines, amplified by the wind rushing past at 200 miles per hour, would make thinking nearly impossible. Cooper would have been standing on a slick metal surface, tilted at a steep angle, in near-zero visibility, with hurricane-force winds tearing at his body. And he still had to jump. The crew in the cockpit monitored their instruments carefully. At 8:13 p.m., they felt it. A sudden, sharp change in the aircraft's trim. The tail section dipped. The nose pitched up slightly. First Officer Bob Radizak later recalled, "It was unmistakable. Something had changed the weight distribution of the aircraft. We knew immediately. He'd gone." A warning light on the panel confirmed it. The aft air stair was fully extended. Dan Cooper had jumped into the storm. The moment Cooper left the aircraft, he entered one of the most hostile environments imaginable. At 10,000 feet, the air temperature was approximately 7 degrees Fahrenheit, or about -13 degrees Celsius. Factor in the wind chill from free-falling at over 120 miles per hour, and the effective temperature drops to around -70 degrees. Cooper was wearing a thin business suit, a white shirt, a black tie, loafers, and a lightweight raincoat. No gloves, no helmet, no cold weather gear whatsoever. Frostbite would begin within seconds. His exposed hands and face would start to freeze. His eyes would water uncontrollably, limiting his vision even further. But the cold was just one problem. In a typical skydive from 10,000 feet, a jumper reaches terminal velocity, approximately 120 miles per hour, within about 10 seconds. At that speed, you're falling at roughly 176 feet per second. From 10,000 feet, Cooper had approximately 50 seconds of free fall before he'd need to deploy his parachute. Wait too long, and he wouldn't have enough altitude for the chute to fully inflate before impact. But Cooper wasn't in a typical skydive scenario. He was jumping at night, in a storm, with zero visibility, over mountainous terrain covered in dense forest. He had no altimeter, no GPS, no way to judge his altitude except by counting seconds, if he could even think clearly enough to count. Dr. Jean Potvin, a physics professor who has studied the Cooper jump extensively, explains, "The disorientation would be immediate and total. You're tumbling through space with no visual reference points, no horizon, no ground, just blackness and cold and noise." Modern skydivers use specialized equipment to handle these conditions. Night vision goggles, GPS altimeters, audible altitude warnings, oxygen systems for high-altitude jumps. Cooper had none of this. He had 2 parachutes. The main chute was a military surplus NB-8, a reliable parachute used by paratroopers. It was a round canopy design, not the more maneuverable rectangular chutes used by sport jumpers today. The reserve chute, the backup in case the main failed, was supposed to be a functional emergency parachute. It wasn't. The FBI had provided 4 parachutes at Cooper's request, 2 main chutes and 2 reserves. One of the reserve chutes was a training dummy, a parachute sewn shut and filled with loose material. It was used for teaching students how to pack a chute, not for actual jumping. Somehow, Cooper ended up with the dummy chute. Did he inspect it before jumping? Did he realize it was unusable? The FBI doesn't know. If Cooper tried to deploy that reserve chute during his descent, thinking it was functional, he would have pulled the ripcord and gotten nothing. No canopy, no drag, just a useless bag of fabric. But let's assume Cooper successfully deployed the main NB-8 parachute. Even with a functioning chute, he still had enormous problems. The wind was gusting to 80 miles per hour. In parachuting, wind drift is calculated based on wind speed and time under canopy. With an 80-mile-per-hour crosswind, Cooper could have been blown miles away from his exit point before he even reached the ground. And he was descending into complete darkness. The terrain below was a mix of dense forest, rocky ridges, and the Lewis River. In daylight, with modern equipment, it would be a challenging landing zone. At night, in a storm, it was essentially unsurvivable. Trees in the Pacific Northwest can reach 200 feet tall. Landing in a tree at 15 miles per hour, the descent rate under a round parachute could result in broken bones, impalement on branches, or being left hanging dozens of feet above the ground, with no way to get down. Landing in the river meant hypothermia. The water temperature in late November would have been around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time in water that cold, less than 30 minutes. Landing in a clearing, if Cooper could even find one in the dark, was the best-case scenario. But even then, he'd be in the wilderness, miles from civilization, with no supplies, no shelter, and temperatures dropping toward freezing. FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who led the investigation, later wrote, "I don't believe Cooper survived. The odds were so stacked against him that calling it a suicide jump is being generous." But Cooper jumped anyway. At 8:13 p.m., somewhere over the Cascade Mountains, Dan Cooper stepped off the aft air stair of Northwest Orient Flight 305 and fell into history. By dawn on November 25, 1971, the FBI had mobilized one of the largest search operations in American history. The command center was established in Portland. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach took charge of the field investigation. His mission? Find Dan Cooper, dead or alive. But there was an immediate problem. They didn't know exactly where to look. The flight crew had done their best to track the aircraft's position when Cooper jumped. They estimated they were somewhere near the Lewis River, northeast of Portland, over the Cascade Mountain Range. But somewhere near covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness. FBI agents worked with Boeing engineers and meteorologists to create a computer model of the jump. They input the aircraft's speed, 170 knots, the altitude, 10,000 feet, the wind conditions, gusting to 80 miles per hour, the terrain elevation, varying from 1,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. The calculations produced a search zone, approximately 28 miles long. That's 28 miles of mountains, forests, rivers, and ravines. The FBI brought in everything they had: helicopters equipped with infrared cameras, ground teams with search dogs, divers for the rivers, local law enforcement, military support. They searched every day for weeks. They flew grid patterns over the drop zone. They walked the riverbanks. They checked every small airport, every gas station, every hospital within 200 miles. They interviewed parachute experts, former military jumpers, anyone who might have information about someone with the skills to attempt what Cooper did. The search expanded to include over 800 military personnel at one point. Soldiers combed through the forests on foot, looking for any sign: a piece of parachute fabric, footprints, the money bag, a body. They found nothing. The Cascade Range is unforgiving terrain. The forests are so dense that visibility from the air is almost zero. The underbrush is thick. The topography is steep and broken. Ravines and canyons create hidden pockets where something or someone could lie undiscovered for decades. Veteran Search and Rescue Coordinator Don Shook later said, "You could hide a Boeing 727 in those woods and never find it. One man with a parachute? Forget it." As weeks turned into months, the FBI scaled back the physical search, but they never stopped investigating. Every tip was followed up. Every potential sighting was checked. Every person who matched Cooper's description and had parachute experience was interviewed. The investigation generated over 1,000 suspects. Some were credible. Most weren't. Meanwhile, the airlines were making changes. The FAA ordered immediate modifications to all Boeing 727 aircraft. A mechanical device, later called the Cooper vane, was installed to prevent the aft air stair from being opened in flight. Metal detectors became mandatory at airports. Carry-on luggage screening was implemented nationwide. The era of casual, unsecured air travel was over. Cooper had changed aviation forever. But the man himself remained a ghost. Then, in February 1980, nearly 9 years after the hijacking, a young boy made a discovery that would reignite the case. 8-year-old Brian Ingram was on a family camping trip along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. While playing on a sandy beach called Tena Bar, he started digging. His hand hit something unusual, a packet of disintegrated paper. Then another, and another. He'd found money. Lots of it. When the FBI examined the bills, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to D.B. Cooper. There were 3 bundles, about $5,800 in total, badly deteriorated, held together by rubber bands that had mostly rotted away. The bills were fragile, partially decomposed, and embedded in sand. The discovery raised immediate questions. How did the money get there? Tena Bar was along the Columbia River, but not directly under the flight path. If Cooper had landed in the river, his body and the rest of the money should have been found too. Bodies surface, money floats. But only $5,800 out of $200,000 turned up. Where was the rest? FBI forensic teams analyzed the bills. The conditions suggested they'd been submerged and buried for years. But the layering of the bills, how they were stacked and compressed, didn't match what would happen if they'd simply washed up naturally. Some investigators believed the money had been deliberately buried. Others thought it was deposited by river dredging operations. Still others suggested it could have washed downstream from somewhere upriver after Cooper landed. The Tena Bar money became one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case. But it didn't answer the central question: what happened to D.B. Cooper? Over the decades, dozens of theories have emerged. Let's examine the most credible ones. Theory 1. He died in the jump. This is the FBI's official position. Special Agent Larry Carr, who reopened the case in 2007, stated, "Diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in a storm, he didn't survive. We're confident of that." The evidence supports this. The extreme conditions, the lack of cold weather gear, the useless reserve parachute, the hostile terrain. Even experienced military paratroopers say the jump was nearly suicidal. Former Green Beret and skydiving expert Dick Tosaw said, "Cooper made mistakes. He took the wrong parachute. He jumped in the worst possible conditions. If he was an experienced jumper, he didn't show it." If Cooper died in the jump, his body could be anywhere in that vast wilderness. Decomposed by now, scattered by animals, buried under decades of fallen leaves and forest debris. Theory 2. He survived and disappeared. Some investigators believe Cooper was more skilled than the FBI gives him credit for. Perhaps he was a former Air Force paratrooper, a Special Forces operative, or a CIA pilot. He could have planned the jump carefully, memorized the terrain, and had an escape route prepared. Maybe he had a vehicle stashed nearby. Maybe he had accomplices waiting for him. If Cooper survived, he would have needed to get out of the wilderness quickly. He'd have been cold, possibly injured, and carrying a heavy bag of cash. But if he'd trained for this scenario, it's theoretically possible. Proponents of this theory point to Cooper's calm demeanor during the hijacking. He never panicked. He knew exactly what he was doing. That suggests experience, maybe even military experience. Theory 3. He had inside help. A less common but intriguing theory. Cooper wasn't working alone. Maybe someone on the ground was tracking the flight. Maybe he had an accomplice who knew the terrain and was waiting at a predetermined location. This would explain how he could disappear so completely. It would also explain why no trace of him, except the money, was ever found. But there's no evidence for this theory. No intercepted communications. No suspicious activity near the drop zone. No accomplices ever came forward. Theory 4. He was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. On April 7, 1972, just 5 months after Cooper's hijacking, a man named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. hijacked United Airlines Flight 855 using an almost identical method. He demanded $500,000. He had the crew fly low and slow. He parachuted out over Utah. But McCoy was caught. He left fingerprints. He landed near his home. The FBI arrested him 2 days later. McCoy was a former Army Green Beret and an experienced parachutist. He matched Cooper's general description, and his hijacking was so similar that investigators couldn't ignore the connection. But there were problems with this theory. McCoy was taller than Cooper. Fingerprints from the Cooper case didn't match McCoy's, and McCoy had witnesses placing him in Utah on Thanksgiving 1971, 2 days after the Cooper hijacking. The FBI investigated thoroughly and concluded McCoy was not Cooper. Theory 5. He was never meant to survive. One of the darker theories. Cooper's hijacking was a death wish. He needed money, maybe to pay off debts, maybe to leave to his family, and he didn't care if he survived. This would explain why he jumped in such terrible conditions, why he didn't seem concerned about the equipment, why he asked for parachutes but didn't inspect them carefully. If this is true, Cooper succeeded in his goal. He got the money into the wilderness, where someone, maybe a family member, could eventually recover it. Then, he jumped to his death. It's speculative, but it fits some of the evidence. The FBI investigated over 1,000 suspects. Some were credible. Most were fantasists or attention seekers. The most famous suspects include Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient employee who allegedly made cryptic comments before his death. Dwayne Weber confessed to his wife on his deathbed that he was Cooper, but evidence was inconclusive. Robert Rackstraw, a former Army Special Forces pilot with a shady past. Some investigators believe he's the strongest candidate. None have been definitively proven to be D.B. Cooper. On July 13, 2016, they officially closed the D.B. Cooper case. After 45 years, thousands of investigative hours, and millions of dollars spent, they concluded the case was unsolvable. The evidence had gone cold. The witnesses were aging or deceased. The physical clues had led nowhere. The FBI released a final statement. Every time we've followed a lead, it's ended in disappointment. We've exhausted all credible avenues. But closing the case didn't end the fascination. D.B. Cooper has become an American legend, a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion against authority. There are Cooper festivals, Cooper documentaries, Cooper websites. Amateur sleuths spend years investigating the case. New theories emerge constantly. Why are we so fascinated by this story? Maybe it's because Cooper represents something we all fantasize about. Getting away with it, beating the system, disappearing without a trace. Or maybe it's the mystery itself. In an age where everything is tracked, recorded, and monitored, the idea that someone could vanish completely feels almost impossible. But behind the legend is a more complicated truth. What Cooper did was a federal crime. He threatened the lives of 42 people on that plane. He strapped a bomb to his chest, or at least something he claimed was a bomb, and terrorized innocent passengers and crew. Flight attendant Tena Bar, who spent hours with Cooper during the hijacking, later said, "He was polite, yes, but he was also a criminal. He put us all at risk. I've never romanticized what he did." The legacy of D.B. Cooper is also written in aviation history. The Cooper vein on every Boeing 727, the metal detectors at every airport, the armed air marshals on flights, the reinforced cockpit doors. Every security measure we take for granted today traces back, in part, to what happened on November 24th, 1971. So what really happened to D.B. Cooper? Did he die in the jump, his body lost in the mountains? Did he survive and live out his days under a new identity? Is he still out there, watching the documentaries, reading the theories, smiling at how close, or how far, we've come to the truth? We may never know. The Cascade Mountains keep their secrets. The forests don't give up their dead easily. Somewhere in those woods, or in that river, or buried under decades of earth, the answers remain. Dan Cooper jumped into a storm and vanished into history. And 54 years later, the mystery endures. But the story doesn't end here. Next Monday, we're releasing episode 3, The Suspects. Who was D.B. Cooper, really? We'll investigate the most compelling suspects, examine the evidence that pointed to each one, and reveal why the FBI could never make an arrest. From decorated war heroes to con artists, from airline employees to covert operatives, the list of suspects reads like a crime novel. And one of them might actually be Cooper. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Do you think Cooper survived the jump? Or did he die in those mountains? Drop your theory in the comments below. Was he a criminal genius, or just a desperate man who got lucky? And here's the big question. If you found that money on the riverbank, would you have turned it in? If you're hooked on this mystery, subscribe to Global Crime Vault 360 and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss episode 3 next Monday. We're bringing you the untold stories, the forgotten cases, the mysteries that changed history. Join us next week as we unmask the suspects in the D.B. Cooper case. Until then, stay curious.